Thank you for joining the community information session, Negotiating the Transition to Adulthood with Spina Bifida. My name is Judy Thibodeau, and I am SBA's National Director of Research and Services. We are joined by my colleague, Juanita Panliner, SBA's National Resource Manager. I want to mention a few things before we get started. You will remain muted throughout the session, but we want your input. Please submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. If we are unable to answer your questions during the presentation, we will address them in a follow-up Ask the Expert session. We will provide details about that session when we send an email with today's recording. We are recording today's session. Everyone who registered for this event will receive a link to the recording. Closed captioning is enabled. The chat function will not be available today. If you have any technical issues, please email Juanita Panliner, JPANLENER@SBAA.org. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jennifer Queally. Dr. Queally is a clinical neuropsychologist and a member of the Spina Bifida program team at Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Queally.
Great, thanks Judy and Juanita for working behind the scenes. I'm going to talk today, hang on now, I'm struggling with the mouse. I'm going to talk today about negotiating the transition to adulthood. And while we're going to talk about some Spina Bifida specific needs, one of the things that I always say before I start giving a talk is that every single patient is different, and everyone has different needs. And that's part of the reason, as a neuropsychologist, I feel like assessment of individual needs is so important, so that we don't make assumptions about what everyone's skills look like. So today we're going to start by discussing some of the strategies to support transition to adulthood. We'll talk about how to identify what skills we need and to think about how we're going to build these skills and even evaluate what kinds of supports may be necessary. And then towards the end, actually, I think I moved this towards the beginning so we had a better sense of some of these difficulties, but we'll talk about, I chose 3 areas that I feel like are common challenges for a lot of my teenage and young adult patients, even if they don't have spina bifida. They just tend to be common issues that people experience. So how difficulties with attention, executive functioning, or information processing, and then processing speed can affect our performance on some of these adulting tasks. All right, so first I wanted to start with what actually happens at age 18. There are a lot of legal responsibilities that the young adult or the adolescent assumes the day that they wake up, right? So they wake up, their 18th birthday, and they take responsibility for all of these different areas of decision-making. So it's medical decision-making, which is going to be a lot of what we talk about today because this is spina bifida specific, but this may mean which doctors they see, what appointments they attend, where they go for care, what care they want to engage with. There's educational decisions. Do they want to remain in school? They're then in charge of signing an IEP or a 504 plan. And after students turn 18, unless there's a signed release in place, schools are forbidden by law to contact parents, even if they're living in your home. There's social decision-making, and these are the things that are a little bit more complicated. Where am I going to live? Am I able to get married? Can I have a child? Who makes these decisions? That I'm ready or that I'm prepared and able to do this? And even who do I spend time with? And then financial decisions. How do we manage our own money? How are we budgeting? Who's going to pay what bills? And who's going to manage the money to pay for things like medical care, housing, etc.? This is a lot of responsibilities. And most of my young adult patients, and even friends of my children, are not good at this at age 18. There's a lot of stuff to learn about adulting. There are no secret classes that I found at high schools that go over all this information. Kids have to learn this on the side, outside of school, with everything else going on. And I feel like there's an additional burden for patients with spina bifida that makes it even harder. So not only do we have to take on regular decision-making, but most patients with spina bifida have a much more complicated medical history. They have a lot more doctors. They have a much more complicated medical history that they have to report to other people. And they have more complicated medical care needs in terms of scheduling appointments, working towards procedures, keeping themselves healthy. In terms of educational decisions, a lot of patients with spina bifida have 504 plans at school. They may have an IEP if they have difficulties with learning. Both of those require annual meetings, et cetera, which again, students who don't have a major medical condition may not have to go to any of those meetings. Social decision-making, I feel like, is always another level of challenge because of all of the medical care and mobility needs that a lot of my patients experience. And then with financial decisions, there can be real bills for these 18-year-olds working on medical care and other types of needs, okay? So one of the things that I want to highlight is that, and this is the way that I talk about it with my patients all the time, legally, you as a young adult are able to make these decisions. If your parents are kind enough to allow you to live at home, especially if it's rent-free as an 18-year-old, that may mean that they have certain things that they expect for you to stay in the home. In which case, they may say that like, you have to have a part-time job, or you have to stay in high school, or you have to participate in your medical care, et cetera, because you're living at home. Now, legally, that may not be the case. But in order for you to receive the things that you're receiving, you do need to be able to follow their rules, because that's the relationship. That being said, I will sometimes have families say like, oh, well, that's not the way our culture works, or like, oh, she's a young female. It's not the same for them. And it really is. Legally, the legal system does not care if you're ready or not. This is going to happen the day you turn 18, which is why we want to prepare early and provide as many supports as we can. And then as we move towards transitioning or transferring to adult care, make sure that patients are as ready as possible. I think the other thing to think about, I work in a pediatric institution. We're used to working with families. Parents are very involved in care. And as young adults go through this transfer of care from pediatric care to adult care, how medical teams engage with them is a little bit different. So really, decision-making should go to the young adult, even if there's a parent in the room, unless there is some kind of legal support that's in place, like guardianship or some kind of conservatorship, depending on what state you live in. Even with shared decision-making, the young adult is making the call. All right, and I'm going to use this word adulting, which is totally made up and it's a fake word. But when I'm talking about adulting, it's like engaging in these everyday tasks that we need to do to be healthy and safe. And I think the challenges that we run into with adulthood happen around the fact that there's multiple things that have to take place every day at some point during the day. But for most adults, their schedules are a lot more flexible and a lot less regulated than they were when they were in high school. So in high school, it's very easy to remember to categorize if you're going right after math class before language arts. It's a whole different thing if you're at a job for 8 hours, or if you're going to a program, or if you're at home to keep track of the passage of time, what's coming next on my schedule, etc. So the fact that there's multiple tasks and multiple routines daily, that you're responsible for the bulk of them if you're living independently, the fact that there are multiple different types of tasks, so there may be medical care, some financial things, some self-care, some home care, all that need to take place in the evenings after work. There's no more prompting unless mom or dad are texting you, which is possible, or you have some kind of an app that has reminders in it. You're not going to get the same level of supervision and reminders as you did when you were a teenager. And like I mentioned, these open-ended schedules make things a little bit more complicated. But I think the hardest thing for all young adults to manage, regardless of whether they have a medical condition, are emergencies. These are things that are outside the realm of normal. They haven't happened before. And so we don't know what to do with them. And this becomes even more complicated for patients that are having medical emergencies, particularly if there's a possibility it's affecting the way that their brain is currently functioning, right? So severe pain, head pain, any difficulties with hydrocephalus management, a shunt, all of those things affect your ability to make decisions in the moment. All right, so what do we know? This is my little pitch. I'm a neuropsychologist. I'm going to say this during every single talk that Judy and Juanita give me the opportunity to give. I do think it's so important to get an evaluation, and it's never too late. There are adult neuropsychologists that can do an assessment too, but every individual is different. We inherit strengths and weaknesses from our parents. Our medical conditions put us at a certain risk for some potential difficulties and some potential strengths, but none of these things are set in stone. And so really understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, what you're good at, what's harder for you is really important. I think everybody on the planet should get neuropsych testing. Unfortunately, your insurance company doesn't agree unless you have a major medical condition. But I think that this helps to guide a few things. If you're planning on going on to college, we often need an assessment that's less than 3 years old in order to get services in college. And if your public high school is willing to do the assessment and that's enough documentation for the college, that's great. But I do have a lot of patients who come back in between 16 and 18 because they need those documentations for extended time accommodations and things like that at school. I feel like it also helps identify key areas of challenge and to start to think about different ways that we can support them. And one of the big transitions in adolescence to young adulthood is starting to do your own self-advocacy. And so knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at, what the proper terms are, how to talk about it, is a skill that needs to be practiced. This is not something that we wake up having one day. And so learning more about yourself, going through an evaluation process when you're older and have some understanding of what your skills are can be really helpful. So I'm just going to run through those 3 domains that I mentioned at the beginning to give people a better sense of like how different skills that are strengths or weaknesses can affect your performance with all of these adulting things. And it's something for us to all keep in the back of our mind as we move forward, because we all struggle with these things at some point. So attention is technically your ability to focus on something in front of you that you're trying to do while screening out things around you. So oftentimes attention difficulties are described as distractibility, which is common. We see that in ADHD, we see that in other medical conditions. Being distractible, noticing things around you, having a hard time focusing does happen to a lot of people. And it happens a lot when we don't understand what's going on. So if I went to an astrophysics lecture today, I would be distractible within about 3 minutes because I would not understand anything that anyone was talking about. That being said, we also see difficulties with becoming hyper-focused, where we're super focused on what's in front of us and we don't notice things going on around us. And if we can think about this like evolutionarily, like if we were climbing through the weeds, trying to find our lunch, and we see a little snack that we're like trying to sneak up on, like we're so focused on being quiet, where the snack is, how to grab him, that we don't even notice something is sneaking up on us behind us. And this, sometimes I'll have parents say that when their kids watching TV, the smoke alarm could be going off and they would have no idea. So you can see how both of these attention difficulties could interfere with our ability to be successful. And it's really important to determine whether it's actually an attention problem or whether it's a comprehension problem. Because if we don't understand, it's impossible to pay attention and to make sense of the information because we're not actually processing it. So what do we do if we know attention gets in our way? Having information and supplies in well-organized formats that you can easily access is really important. So if there's a sequence you have to go through every single time, the sequence should be written down. It should be easily accessible. You can pull it up on your phone. An app reminds you, something like that, where you've got all of the steps in front of you and you don't have to try and remember all of the steps, because if you're having trouble focusing, doing 2 or 3 things at the same time is going to be a really big challenge. We want to try and make as many things into rote sequences as possible. If once you start a routine, you go all the way through the whole routine without being distracted, without anything interfering, you're much more likely to be successful than you are if you're having to think of each step, keep track of where you are in the process and things like that. So the more we practice, the better off we are. If we can limit multitasking, this goes along with the same things, right? If we can limit multitasking, only doing one thing at a time, instead of asking our brains to do 2 or 3 things at the same time, we tend to do better with attentional focus. And this, again, is like literally everyone. It diminishes our distractions and it gets rid of a lot of external information. And then start to think about what times are better for you. So I do better at the crack of dawn, even though I secretly want to be a night owl and I enjoy staying up late. My brain works better in the mornings. So when I get up early and I start working, I choose the things that are hardest for me that I need to get done first so that I get them out of the way. So let's talk a little bit about information processing and executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are very trendy. We like to talk about them. We just had one of these informational sessions on executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are higher level skills that are really dependent upon most of your brain working perfectly. So I can destroy executive functioning skills of basically everybody around me by stressing their brains. This is why, like, if someone close to you is sick, you may forget to eat that day. How is that possible? You've literally eaten 3 or 4 meals a day since you were born every day, and suddenly you forget to eat. That doesn't make any logical sense. That's your executive functioning system falling apart because it's stressed. Information processing is a little bit different. This is how we take in information from the outside environment. Both of these things get destroyed if attention isn't there. So if we're not attending to the information, it's really hard to process it, and it's really hard to plan or create a problem-solving strategy to manage the issue because we don't even know what information we're dealing with. So all of these systems work together in unison, and that's why we have to be really careful that none of these systems are stressed. So some examples of executive functioning skills are things like initiating tasks, figuring out what's the first step, what's the second step, what are the expectations here, switching between tasks, so stopping what I'm doing and switching to something else that needs to be taken care of more urgently, and the ability to go back and finish the other task. So something like getting up to Kath when your watch alarm goes off. Multitasking and monitoring progress. So doing 2 things at once is required if you are monitoring your progress for accuracy or task completion. So if you're keeping track of like, oh, did I fill up the bin or did I do all the pieces? You're actually asking your brain to multitask already. And so if you're adding on a second or a third task, everything's going to start to fall apart. Integrating information to comprehend content is another executive function. This requires multiple things to happen at the exact same time. And this is why, even if we're very good at social skills and we're very good at reading facial expressions and we're very good at understanding vocal tone and what people are saying, and we're really good at language, but we sometimes struggle in social situations, that's when all of our information is not being pulled together effectively. And sometimes that's because of processing speed. Sometimes that's because of how much information we can hold in our brain at once. And sometimes it's because of stressors in the system, okay? And then holding information in working memory is how much stuff we can hold in our brain before our brain gets full. This, again, is taxed by our environment. So on average, it's about 7 things. However it is, we can chunk and organize them. But I can destroy your ability at the grocery store to remember 4 items that you went in there to buy, because with like the crafty advertising that they do, right? You walk up and down these aisles to go get things and you're like, oh, cereal's on sale. I wonder if I should get some because I was kind of low. I'm not out, but it's cheaper now. How much cheaper is it? And like, I'm starting to lose track of those 4 items that were in my brain when I came into the grocery store. So multitasking and switching are required for individuals to start activities, complete their daily routines, and then restart a task. And this is why interrupting our daily routine to do something that we need to do that's time sensitive can be so challenging. And I want to bring up emotions because oftentimes with young adults, we see a lot of anxiety, and we sometimes see symptoms of depression or sadness when we move out, we go to school, we don't go with our friends, we have a hard time connecting with others. And we see a lot of anxiety when people are trying new things for the first time. Being anxious, being depressed, having symptoms of anxiety or depression requires multitasking. You have to recognize the emotion, you have to engage a strategy in order to address it, and then you have to implement the strategy to address it. All of those things are going on while you're trying to do another task. So if you think about something like a piano recital in front of other people, you have to go up there, everyone's staring at you. Even though you've practiced the music, you haven't practiced the music with 40 people staring at you. You're on a slightly different piano than you normally practice on because you're in a recital hall, right? And like all these little things are happening that are taxing your brain. And that stress and anxiety of that new situation is causing your brain to have to do 2 things at the same time. Now, if you practice the piano like you were supposed to, right, as your teacher told you, it would be motor memory. you'd have it memorized. And once you started, you could engage the routine and finish it. And that's what we were talking about with practicing and like learning systems so that you've done it so many times, it just becomes automatic. Comprehension of information is also really important. Sometimes we'll get some blips of information and then we hear it again from a different perspective. And then we hear it again from a different perspective. And then it starts to make sense. And really what's going on then is our brain is receiving enough information to make meaning out of the content. And that's a little bit different than just memorizing what someone is saying out loud to us. So what do we do if we know we have challenges in these areas? One of the things that's most important, and this is something we do with younger children and we stop doing with adolescents and young adults because we think they know how to do it on their own, but some people don't, is to teach the strategies separately. So if we think back of like how we were taught to write sentences, like someone clearly sat down with you and was like, you start with an article, like the word the, and then you add in something like a subject, like the name of the character. And then you add in, a conjunct, like some kind of verb or an adverb or an adjective or whatever, and they give you a recipe. And then when you write your sentence, you follow the recipe. When you get to high school, they're like, oh, just write a research paper. And like, that's not enough information. Knowing what is in the strategy, what does that require, is really important. And that helps us be more organized and more successful. So I gave the example of like finding lost items. If you misplace a book and I teach you how to find a lost book, you may not be able to use that strategy to find lost keys. But if when you lose your book, I go over a strategy for finding lost items, even if it's subtly different, then it's much easier to adapt it to different things. So for example, if we were looking for a lost book, we might check our backpack, we might check where we did homework last night, kitchen table, dining room table, desk in our bedroom, etc. We're probably not going to check the floor or the hall closet. If we lose shoes, they might be in the hall or the closet or right by the door or something like that. So if we think about a strategy for finding lost items, we might say, I want you to think about the 3 most likely places where you used that item last. I want you to think about what you were doing when you were using the item. Did you get up to do another task and where might it be? And like, where do we commonly find this object? And like that strategy is slightly different than go look on your desk because it might be there. When we start to decision make as adults, we need the broad-based strategies that we can alter and adapt to novel situations. It doesn't help us to have very specific fine-tuned strategies that we can't adapt very well. We want to teach fundamental systems as much as we can. There's a plan and a backup plan. So I talk a lot about fire alarms. At school, we have fire alarms and kids are very successful at school if there's a fire. They evacuate the building every single time. We do it in a very systematic way. I have some horror stories about children trapped on second floors in wheelchairs, but aside from that, like the system generally works. We know how to do this. We don't evacuate at home when our smoke alarms go off. We tell kids like, oh, no, I burnt a piece of toast, or like daddy was taking a shower. Like it's totally fine. We shut off the noise. Because we teach people to ignore the noise of the smoke detector, they don't respond to it in the future. Even our brains when we're sleeping don't respond to it. And like those are things that are fundamental for us to feel safe about our young adults moving out of the house, that we want to make sure that they're going to respond to things in their environment. There are some times where we have to talk about things that we hope never happen to our kids, but they need to know what the strategy is. What do I do? How am I prepared for this? What happens if I get lost in the grocery store? How do I know who works there? Like any poor individual who goes into a Target store wearing khaki pants and a red shirt is like going to be victimized by every single person who has a question in that store. But we should know that like most people who work at Target wear khaki pants and a red shirt. So if you get lost, separated, can't find an item, that's who you go to. People who work there. That's who is able to help you. Thinking through instruction and how to be 2 steps away, right? So there's certain things where, and I think a lot of these, again, come back to safety, but I would rather teach someone where to store flashlights, how to replace batteries once a year, things along that, instead of teaching them about candles, because candles can be dangerous. They can fall over. You have to have a lighting source. They can be too close to curtains. They can cause a fire. Flashlights don't cause fires. So I'm going to think 2 or 3 steps ahead. What's the potential risk? What's the reward? What's necessary? We live in a place with a lot of hurricanes. Candles don't work anyway when they're wet. Like, we need a flashlight that's waterproof. So like, how do we think 2 or 3 steps ahead to make sure that our young adult is ready and they have a system that they can employ? All right, and processing speed I chose as another one. So this does affect a lot of my patients with spina bifida. It affects a lot of my patients that have been through a lot of surgeries. And it affects kids who have changes in their motor system development. Having slower processing speeds can be a really big challenge when you can't slow down your environment. And while we can support this a little bit at school, it's really hard for us to support this at home in the same way, or in the outside world, the adulting world. That being said, if I know that I need extra time, and I know that I need people to talk slower, and I know that I need a minute to think through my answer, I should know strategies for doing that. And I should have practiced them so many times that I feel comfortable doing it. So if I do this, you guys all know that we have to wait a minute, right? That's like a universal sign. We just stick our finger up and we're like, ooh, wait, I need a minute. We can teach kids scripted language to ask people to slow down, to repeat information, to go back, or even before the visit starts, I need you to work at a slower pace. Now, I can't change the way the cars operate and how rapidly they operate, but we can get accommodations in some places if we advocate for ourselves. So while practice does not make perfect, although I really like that moniker because I think practicing does help you, it does create routines which speed things up. The more times you do things, the easier it is for your brain to deploy the strategy and to do it efficiently. And that's something to keep in the back of your mind. So if something takes you literally forever, do it more, not less. Unless you're a millionaire, in which case farm it out and pay somebody else to do it for you. But that's not very practical for most of our life experiences. If we can be prepared, then that saves us a lot of time. So like sometimes I'll ask patients, like, can you tell me all your medical conditions? And it takes them a while to think of everything. They can do it. But like what I really needed to know is their allergies. And that's what came to their brain last. Why don't we have it written down? And then we can just reference it. Why don't we have photos of things in our phone? Why don't we have our medical portal with an automatic login? Like, let's find strategies that can support individuals in situations to function independently and to be proud of their ability to function independently, instead of challenging them repeatedly by sticking them in situations where it's harder to be successful. All right, so I'm going to run through a couple of different things that happen around transition. Going to school, more school after high school, is something that a lot of my patients are doing now. And it's a little bit different. You can receive supports and services, but you cannot receive special education services unless you're paying for them above and beyond college. Most colleges don't provide these supports. That being said, there are a lot of supports that you can get at school to help you with slower processing speed, production speeds, things with organization, etc. So in the transition to college, having these evaluations done can be really helpful, whether it's done by the school or by a neuropsychologist. There's an Office of Disability Services on most campuses that can go through what different accommodations schools can provide. And most of them have learning support centers, whether it's a writing lab or a math center that's staffed by students, graduate students, professors at certain times. There's tutoring centers. Like, we want to think of different things that can be helpful. And I don't want to insinuate that things like writing labs, math centers, and tutoring centers are necessary for all patients, because they're not. But one of my favorite things about tutoring centers is getting paired up with a student that's 2 or 3 years ahead of you in school and has had most of the professors you may have, understands the task demands of different things that are handed out, can tell you which teachers not to take. Like, is it worth it to get up at 8 in the morning in order to avoid this other professor or not? They've got all the good information. And so working with a tutor that's in your major is sometimes really helpful just for that, and for social means to meet other people that are doing what you're doing. And I want you guys to think consciously about making these choices. College is a lot of money. If you're going to spend the money, they should be able to meet you where you are as a learner and to provide the supports that would help you be the most successful. So these are just some of the different services that you can get at different colleges. Pre-registration for classes. I've had colleges rearrange classes to be on the first floor to better support individuals who have mobility challenges so that they're not spending 15 minutes trying to get to an elevator and navigate to a different floor. Extended time for assignments and exams, central storage places, especially on larger campuses where you can keep materials midway in the campus instead of in your dorm room. Assistance with mobility. So I'm in New England. It's a little bit different than those of you guys who are in warm weather climates. Like sometimes we just need our sidewalks done first so that we can use our crutches to get to school and like not slip and die, right? Like these are things we want to avoid if at all humanly possible. Anything that slows us down or becomes an impediment. We want our environment to be safe and accessible. And then again, support through different tutoring centers or supports. I also want to make sure that I emphasize that like most campuses have medical supports of some kind, okay? Not always emergency medical services, but sometimes they have clinics or other things like that that can be helpful. And it's really important to speak to the school staff about things like latex allergies. You don't want the RA in the dorm blowing up 30 balloons and taping them to your roommate's door because they're having a birthday. Like having the ability to advocate is really important, but knowing what you have to advocate for in your environment is also super important. Thinking about I had one college that did it's like a program on safe sex, and they were using latex condoms, and like it didn't even occur to my patient because no one had ever talked with her about using latex condoms or not using latex condoms and how that may be a safety risk. So like learning how to advocate for yourself, bring up concerns and questions, talking with disability supports about how this may affect things. And then to start thinking about like, how am I going to get my supplies on campus, especially if I'm not living at home or I'm in a different state? And then how do I access other supports that I may need? So we talked a little bit about anxiety before, symptoms of depression, feeling socially isolated, knowing how to access the counseling center, whether or not we pay for services, whether or not they're free. Can we go for a couple of sessions just to get adjusted? These are things that all young adults should be aware of because your tuition is paying for these services. Some of my young adults go straight to work instead of going on to do more school. Starting a new job involves a lot of changes, not just in learning new expectations and new skills, but also managing a new environment with mobility issues, trying to figure out how we access all of the different medical things that we need to do during the day in a private way without disrupting the work schedule. All of the ADA accommodations that are provided through like a 504 plan in high school can be continued through working environments and in college throughout the rest of your lives. These supports are to level the playing ground to make it fair so that you can maintain your health and be successful. So you should not feel bad about asking for bathroom accommodations or a stool to sit on because sometimes these things are necessary for us to do our jobs. And in a lot of states, and this varies depending on what state you're in, but a lot of states are providing workplace supports where they might do job training. You might have a job counselor who's working with you offline. You might have someone in the job that's working with you online, and thinking through all the different steps of the job. So for example, I had one kid who got a job during college at like a grocery store and a bakery. He loved baking. He was really good at that. No problems with that at all. What he struggled with is figuring out how to work those horrible plastic containers that all the bakery items go into. So thinking about which way was up, which direction the sticker went on, how to open them all, how to position them. And it seemed like such a silly question. He was like embarrassed to ask people, but it was something that his job coach spent 5 minutes trying to figure out how to fix for him. And it worked. And that's all that person needed was like a little tiny bit of like a prompt or a cue or something to think about it a little bit differently. And these things are really important. We can ask about them through the public schools. That helps us with eligibility and with referrals so that these services are in place before we leave school. I do see that there's things popping up in the chat. I'm going to try and make it through the slide so I have some time at the end. Okay, so with medical transitions, this gets really hard. There's so many different things. It depends on your actual treatment facility, especially for children, when you're going to transition to adult care. At our institution, you transition to adulthood at age 18. You transfer to adult care in your early 20s. So like 22, 23, we start to move you on to adult care. It really depends on where you are when this might happen. And it's important to recognize that sometimes all of these transitions are happening at the same time. Leaving home, leaving high school, leaving your medical setting, these are all new changes. Anyone would be anxious and a little bit overwhelmed with all of this new stuff swirling around. So we need to think about how we get people prepared beforehand. So meeting new doctors is a big deal, especially if you've had the same set of doctors for 15 or 20 years. There's a lot of medical history. Sometimes we don't know what's important or not important for a new provider to know. We don't always know how we work. Like many of our patients, we've figured out in the pediatric facilities, oh, this person likes stuff written down. This person really likes the portal, so I'll put it in the note. This person wants it on a sticky note, so it can go on their desk at home. Like those kinds of like little things about you as a patient, you should be able to advocate for these things, but you need to know what they are so that you can tell others what you want from them. Okay. So do we need written directions? How, is verbal enough? Can you tape record them? Like what works best for you? One of the things that I try to have all my patients do before I leave, I start with working on transition at like 12 or 14 with our patients, is I'll say like, okay, what did we talk about today? What is your homework after today's visit? What's my homework? When's our follow-up? So that I know that we're both on the same page at the end of our visit, because we've talked about 20 things in the past half an hour. One of the other things that I want to suggest is to plan in advance for your visits, because this helps you be ready. So before you go in for your visit, pull your last note from that provider out of the portal, print it out, write on it. These are the things that have come up for me over the past couple of months. This is what I want to ask about. And then that helps us in the visit to be more ready and prepared. And so if we only have 15 minutes with a provider, we already know what we want to say. We don't think of it 10 minutes after we leave. Because that's the worst feeling ever, right? Is that we didn't get to ask our questions. So in terms of the organizational needs for medical, I think one of the most important things here is that parents recognize the way that they organize care may not be the same way that their kids do. I think the portal is like a perfect example. I have learned to suffer through my portal, but I'm old and crunchy. I like to talk to humans. I like to call and speak to nurses. It makes me feel better to know that like I have everything all set. I understand that young adults would rather send a text message and a gross photo of some sore they have on their foot at 2 o'clock in the morning, and that's fine if that works for them. Everybody needs a way to engage with their medical system, and it may be different, right? When I first started, I'm so old, people would bring in binders with like hundreds of pages in them, and that's how we got medical records. Like everything's different now. One of the things, though, that I've noticed, at least in the Boston area, and this may or may not be an option where you live, but selecting one hospital system for your PCP and all of your specialist providers to be in allows for them to have much stronger communication than when they have to cross systems. So it's something to keep in mind when you're choosing your adult PCP that you'll be changing to. It's like, how do I find one that's in the system where I would be seeking care through the hospital? All right, and then managing medical visits. Thinking about, am I going to go alone? Do I need somebody there to help me remember information? Do I need somebody there to help me remember my questions? Do I need someone there because I need a ride or I need help navigating the hospital? Or I always get confused and overwhelmed when I have to go to this one office because I can't find it. Thinking about like what kinds of instructions work for you, knowing all of this before you get there is really important. And you can always throw your adults out. But most providers are going to allow you to bring in a parent or bring in a sibling if they want to be present during the visit. If we want to talk about secret things, we'll ask them to leave, okay? And you can make a choice. Just be mindful of the fact that the young adult gets to make the decision in the end about treatment engagement, okay? All right, so independent living. There's so many different things, and we don't think about it because most of these are routine. We're so used to them that we don't think outside the box. For example, one of my favorite things are pill boxes, and I'll have patients say like, I only have one medicine to take. It's not a big deal. And I understand that like maybe we're not putting 8 medications in a pill box, but you know what a pill box does do? It lets us check if we took our meds, if we can't remember at noon. So understanding, I'm going to go back and double check. I'm a little bit worried I didn't take my medicine. We don't want them to double dose. That's a perfectly easy way to do it. Or you could have an app that you check off after you take the medication, or you can keep track of it in some other way. all of these things need to be tailored for the individual. But thinking consciously about the fact that if you as a parent is the double check, that may not exist every day in life when they move out of your house. Okay, so any of these difficulties, not great planning. If they're planning to get a ride to a medical visit and they give themselves 20 minutes to get ready, and you know in your heart of hearts that it's going to take them 45 minutes, how do we think about this? How do we be more supportive of like how we support independence and how we plan for it? And keep in mind that every new thing that we're asking people to do requires rehearsal in order for us to get good and fast at it. And that's for every single brain on the planet. We can oftentimes start with a few steps and build up from there. We do small pieces of it. We do parts of the task. We receive some support as we're working through it. And the use of checklists can be really helpful. Everything written down can be checked off, marked off that it's completed. If we're trying to remember it, then we're automatically multitasking. In terms of home living, I think this is one of the more challenging things, especially around mobility needs. We live in New England. I swear every single laundry room on the planet is in the basement. I don't know why. It's a pain in the rear end for everybody doing laundry to carry it up and down all these flights of stairs, but it's really prohibitive for patients that are using wheelchairs to get around their homes to like get downstairs to learn how to do laundry. So you know what? Go to a laundromat twice a year and just practice it. I think laundry is one of the hardest things to do, not because putting things in a top loader is kind of hard, although super hard to remove it if you're wheelchair bound. But the words on the machines make no sense. Like, why are they calling it permanent press if it's water? Like some of these things, we just get into the habit of doing it because we've done it so many times. We know how to set our washer and we don't even think about it anymore. But for somebody learning it new, understanding like how far you have to push in the quarters. If you have a card, do you have to swipe it? How much money do you have to have on it? Like there's so many steps involved in this that like practicing it is better. Like the more we can practice it, the better we are. I also find like that there's a lot of kitchens that aren't accessible. We're concerned about open flames because of balance issues. And I'm still afraid of my Instapot, like full disclosure, it sits in my basement. I don't touch it because it scares me, but I love my air fryer. And it decreases the burn risk. It doesn't make my house as hot during the summer. And it's easier to use because it can be on any flat surface. So like, how do we think about different things that we want to set kids up for to be successful? Okay. Laundry, vacuuming, cooking, all of these things have multiple steps and they have secret steps. I'll come back to the secret steps later. Community navigation is another big hurdle. Visual spatial skills are really necessary for us to flip maps in our head and things like that. And this can be an area of challenge for a lot of patients. We also tend to use more verbal cues, but verbal cues require a lot of multitasking. You have to hold all the information in your brain as you're going through the process. We want to make an effort to determine what works for young adults. Okay. How much do they need? How much are they capable of doing? Thinking about what equipment patients need or kids need to do things. So if they can navigate Target using a shopping cart and don't need their crutches, that's fine. But we want to make sure that we've thought about that before we get to the back of Target and are too tired to finish shopping. So like, how do we process and plan for these things? Can we really go to Target, the grocery store, and to another store on the same day? Or is that too much physical activity? Or does that interfere with our bowel program because we're in a Target and it's super hard to cap in their bathrooms, right? Like, how do we think about all these different things that we need to do? I think with things that we can start earlier, and like, I don't know how old your children are now and whether or not I'm preaching to the choir that's already been doing this or not, but things like driving are overwhelming because you're reading street signs, you're trying to navigate where you are, you're trying to get to where you're supposed to be, you're supposed to follow route, signs and traffic and everything else. If you can memorize all the street signs in your town before you start driving, before you start taking the bus, then it's one less thing you have to process. It's automatic. Your brain already knows it. And then there's services like Mass Transit in Massachusetts will come pick you up at your home. We also have PT1 services that are available for families that have certain types of medical insurance, or even Uber and Lyft. They pick you up at your home. You can send a screenshot of who's driving you to another person you care about or be on the phone with them, and they can provide door-to-door services. So let's think about how much effort we might spend on the bus to get somewhere. Does that then make it exhausting to be in that place? Should we plan in advance in a different way? And then budgeting, which is the arch nemesis of every single young adult on the planet. I was an RA in college, and I swear every single one of my students was out of meal plan points by like the end of October and had to starve until December when they all got reset. Managing finances are extremely challenging for everybody to learn because they don't know how much they need of what unless they've been practicing. So if we can set up systems where some money's saved automatically and there's an extraordinarily strict budget, that really helps because then there's backup money if we need it, and we're not going to go outside those little areas. So for example, DoorDash has like an extra $30 fee, I swear, to deliver food. So you might think you're paying $20, but you're really going to get charged $40. So being able to plan for that in advance helps you know that you can't budget for multiple trips from DoorDash. It's just not going to work. But there's other things where, like, I want this certain channel for a couple of months. Maybe your cell phone plan can offer you that for free, right? How do we practice getting services that we need that fit in our budget? These are things that we learn from watching our parents, or we kind of flounder about trying to learn on our own. But it saves us so much time and energy if people model these different things for us. Keep track in a notebook. What happens when you call the cable company? Besides the fact that you have to go through the phone tree before you get there. And then again, teach the thresholds for danger, urgent concerns, and always have a backup plan. And the backup plan can be to call your parents. But we need to know when we need to do that before our lights get shut off, okay? And then I wanted to talk a little bit about victimization. When kids are in school, they're protected, right? They're with same age peers. There's a lot of supervision and support. And even then they're at risk for some levels of potential victimization, like bullying and teasing and things like that. When you leave high school and you go out into the world, whether it's college or a workplace environment, you are surrounded by adults of varying ages. You might work at the grocery store with some people who are 55 when you're 20. And keeping in mind that that 55-year-old has a lot more experience, a lot more savviness about the way the world works, that like puts you more at risk as a young person to be taken advantage of. We have to prepare in advance for this so that we know when we're being taken advantage of, when someone is teasing us, encouraging us to do something. And it's so important that we practice this ahead of time because we need a plan. So like one of my favorite plans is that you text your parent with some secret emoji that you guys have decided on. And that's my like extraction plan. So I don't want to be here anymore. I don't feel safe or comfortable. You text your mom with the emoji. Mom or dad immediately calls and is like, oh, grandma wound up in the hospital. I got to come get you. Where are you? You know, or you're like, you didn't ask permission to stay out this late. I'm going to come pick you up. Gives the parents a way to like extract the kids from the situation that they're in that's not comfortable. But like, what happens if you're on a bus and someone touches your body and you don't want them to? You can't just call your mom to come and pick you up in 20 minutes. Like you're literally sitting next to this person in this moment. So like, what do you do? And how do we practice these situations so that we're prepared for them and we're ready? Because if you don't trust that your young adult is ready, you're not going to want them to move out of the house. So I had one young adult who like seemed to be great at budgeting, had gotten into college, very bright young woman. And she was home alone one day and someone knocked on the door and she couldn't figure out what to do. And when her mom came home, she found her in the closet. Now, the young adult had a cell phone. The doors were locked. But still in that moment, anxiety hijacked all of her thinking and we didn't think of anything else that we could possibly do. Call 911, call mom, anything like that. All those ideas were gone and because we hadn't practiced it. So we want to make sure that we practice them so we know what to do. All right, so how do we build skills? Some of these are kind of specifically laid out and I'll go through them, but I had a couple of general points that I wanted to think about. So daily tasks, we want to think about all the things that need to get done in a day. And if you actually made a list of this for all adults, there's like a million things on here. And if kids can't demonstrate that they can be independent at home, most adults are not going to believe that they can suddenly become independent outside the home. But these need to be open conversations. I need to see these things before I feel safe with you moving out. I promise not to correct you or challenge you on your performance with these things while you're demonstrating to me you can do them. And I think we need to be very clear about what we need before we trust them. We need to be practical. This is the secret steps I was talking about earlier. Vacuuming is my favorite task. So I'll ask people, and I know you guys can read ahead and cheat here a little, but like, what's the first step in vacuuming? And people will say like, oh, you have to plug it in, right? Like they're trying to think of the first step, but the first step really is you have to get it out of the closet. And in my home, because I live in New England with these tiny little closets, like it's behind 14 other things. So I have to get into the closet, extract a bunch of stuff, get the thing, and then I can take the cord off and then I can plug it in, but I have to plug it in a place where I'm not going to vacuum over the cord. I have to pick up all the stuff on the floor before I start vacuuming, or else I suck up everything into the vacuum. Like all of these are secret steps that we haven't gone over. They're not a part of the process that's obvious to others when they're watching you vacuum. So we need to think about those things, and whether you're going to use a note cards to go through all the steps, if you're going to teach people in a stepwise progression what all the steps are, you're going to review it verbally, whatever it is, we have to make sure we do those things, right? So like if you're heating up water to make rice and you have to reduce it to half, like how do you figure out what's half? And like if we have to mark it with a permanent marker on the little thing, like that's fine, but we need to figure out what these strategies are so that we can use them. And then with building skills, with any skill that we've learned, like when we learned how to read, we learned how to read letters and then letter pairs and then short words and then longer words. Like we always build up from the bottom, right? So we go through steps, tiny little pieces, we add on more and more steps, and we get better at it. And I like this kind of progressive teaching where like I talk through the steps when I'm doing it. So I'll have my parents do that with young kids when they're catheterizing. They go through every single step out loud. And then the kids have heard it so many times. When they go to do it, they can hear their parents' voices going through all the steps. Then we take notes, write down the steps so that we've got all the steps. We model the steps. Parents model the steps for the kids. And then the kid completes one or two of the steps. And then the kid completes the whole thing with their parents observing. And then the kid completes the whole thing with their parents standing outside the room in another room and just kind of checks that it was done, right? And this is how we catch the catheterization should take 2 or 3 minutes and is really only taking 10 seconds for some 10-year-old boys who want to get back to their video games. Like those are the steps we need to go through in order to get a routine down pat. So I included these, and I'm going to run through these really quickly, but these just give an idea of like how to make these more progressive. So like with health self-assessment, figuring out what's going on with my body. The first step is that I know some of my medical conditions. The second step is that I know when something's going wrong. How do I know if I'm sick or having symptoms? How do I know to tell somebody else? Do we have an idea of how many doctors we see? Do we know where we go? And then the long-term goal is like, can we tell an absolute stranger we've never met before, like an adult ER doctor, what's going on with our body, right? Without becoming really anxious. Communicating with medical providers. Can we greet new doctors? Can we shake hands? Some of our doctors have their own little ways of interacting with people that's a little bit different depending on who they are. Can they tolerate a new doctor? Can they tolerate being alone with a doctor? Can we ask questions if we're prepared in advance? And then those final goals are like extra credit. Can you throw out your parent because you have a question that you want answered and you don't want to ask in front of mom or dad? Use of medical supplies, medications. The first step is like knowing what things we need. I love cell phones for this because you can make little photo albums. So you can take pictures of all of your DME and all of your medications. So you have the prescription, the company, the number to call, whatever else. It's all saved in one location. Super easy to reference. So do we know that we need to do different tasks, even if the timing's off? Can we do it with the timing? Can we tell parents we're running low on supplies? I don't care if you have to mark the side of the box with like, I have 1 week left of catheters left. Like find a strategy that works for you. Do we know where we're getting prescriptions? And then with training, can we call and refill a script? Can we use an online ordering system? I know DME often comes in the mail, but like, what happens if it doesn't? What happens if there's a storm and the mail's delayed? What do I do then? Access to insurance and medical records. So I think of insurance companies as being remarkably challenging to reach. I'm sure one of you guys works for an insurance company, and I'm very sorry, but I find them challenging to deal with sometimes. So I think this is like an amazing step if my patients are actually capable of engaging with insurance companies successfully, right? So understanding there's a medical record, knowing that people write things down, knowing that information's private, but they can access it, knowing they have insurance. What's the name of their insurance company? Can they call their insurance company? Can they get their questions answered? And then management of lifestyle choices, right? This is fun. This is like sex, drinking, all kinds of stuff. So do we know basic safety rules? And then this again gets a little bit more challenging. Do we have a sense about dating? Do we know about sexual relationships? I will often have adolescents say like, oh, I'm not going to do that for like 10 years. Okay, so once you're living completely independently and you don't see your parents every day, that's going to be the first time you engage in a romantic relationship with someone, not having a good sense of like what boundaries are, whether or not someone's taking advantage of you, etc. How do we know that this is a safe situation? How do we know if the person we met online is actually who they say they are? Like, who do we run this information by? Who helps us kind of double check that this sounds reasonable? All of this is hard for young adults. And it's even harder if we have some challenges with information processing or multitasking and pulling together information. It puts us a little bit more at risk. So how do we know what to do in order to keep ourselves safe? Okay. All right. So in summary, I of course left us 4 minutes to go over things. Scaffold as much as humanly possible. Start small, go through the steps enough times that like everybody can repeat them back, and then they can do them on their own. Prepare for visits and meetings as much as possible. It drives me insane when public schools pull kids into their IEP meeting for the first time at 14 and no one has discussed with them what's going to be asked, what the kid's supposed to tell other people, what part of the meeting the kid's supposed to be in, and how they can contribute. All of those things should be reviewed with the kid a month before so that they can work on being prepared for the meeting. I find IEP meetings overwhelming. Of course, a young adult will for the first time they go, right? How do we get better at these things? And use those opportunities. My patients meet with me alone because I'm a neuropsychologist. I kick parents out. They do boring paperwork in the lobby. I meet with the kids independently, but I'm one of the few medical providers who has the opportunity to see kids working alone. Your school district is the other person. The school districts often have time to meet with kids alone every day for 6 hours. They see what your kids are capable of doing. Use that information to help you and to help your medical team. Parents have to give up some control to allow their kids to practice in real situations with their support. Otherwise, the kids can't ever practice. And try to use as many different organization support strategies as possible. And we can't switch them around all the time. If we're learning a new organizational strategy, we have to get it down pat before rejecting it and saying, I don't like this strategy. I want to try something different. Because the first time it's going to feel uncomfortable. The second time it's going to feel uncomfortable until we actually know how to use that strategy. Thinking about opportunities for rehearsal and practice, reviewing what they know after meetings. I had one patient who did amazing during all of her meetings. She was prepared, she had questions. And as I asked her as she was leaving for the day to summarize what went on, she said that everything went great. And she had 2 medication changes and a diagnostic test scheduled. And like all of those were out of her head because she had had a positive experience socially with all of the doctors. And she hadn't asked at the end of each visit what she was supposed to do for follow-up. All right, so Juanita is your backup for questions, but we have 3 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing. I don't know if Juanita's going to come back.
I am. I'm right here. I've just got my camera off. But thank you so much, Dr. Queally. This is super great. We do have a couple of questions. And one of the questions actually is one that we've heard many people ask, which is just the notion that a lot of what you've mentioned is applicable to many children or every child as they grow up. And so how do we explain this notion then that this is particularly so for people with spina bifida, or that each person with spina bifida might have these issues?
Right. So I think one of the hard things about spina bifida as a medical disorder in neuropsychological care is that we have a profile of strengths and weaknesses that we often see, but that's on a continuum. And so some patients are functioning better than most kids their age or young adults their age, and some are scoring way below. There's a series of different things that we tend to see more challenge with, and those are the things like information processing and executive functioning skills, the processing speed, like I mentioned, the hyper-focusing with attention, and more difficulty with visual spatial skills. So I see one of the questions was about someone whose daughter is a librarian. If I think about what librarians are doing, they're reshelving books, right? They're keeping track of all the different steps. They have to use the Dewey Decimal System still, right, to like locate where the books go. But even putting books back on a bookshelf is kind of hard because it's a spatial task. How much space do I need to fit this book in? How much space is not enough space? What if I have to put 4 books in? Do I have to move books to the next shelf? And how do I determine that? And like, that's a skill that like takes a lot of practice to learn if you have a visual spatial deficit. I think one of the other questions that I see in the chat is asking about other resources outside of your either particular hospital system or your school system. I would say lectures like these can be really helpful. Oftentimes, different universities, different local like school districts will hire people to come in and talk about memory mnemonics or organizing yourself. And any of those things can be really helpful for you. Particularly as I think most of the parents on this call know their kids extraordinarily well. You know what they're good at and not good at. I can do a diagnostic test and write it down for you, but a lot of what I rely on when patients come in is what their parents are telling me they're struggling with. So go to Barnes & Noble, sit on the floor and look through 30 organizational books until you find one you like and try the different strategies. Try it until you've learned it and it either works or doesn't work, but like, how do we move forward with something specific? And if you have a hard time thinking of ideas, that's when we go outside for support. So whether it's a psychologist for therapy, an executive functioning coach that can go through different strategies, somebody who can help you organize your apartment, that can come up with a place for everything to go that helps to create that as a uniformity, all of those things can be really helpful.
Thank you. And then there's one question, we're just 1 minute over, but maybe you can sneak it in. It's, what is your perspective on concepts related to the dignity of risk in working on fostering the development of creative problem solving?
Oh, that is not a 1 minute answer. However, I think that we often learn lessons best when they're significant lessons. What I would like to do for most of my patients, as much as I possibly can, is to protect them from having traumatic, life-altering, kind of risky situations when they're young. Right? As we get older, we make our own choices. Sometimes we wind up in risky situations or we have challenges that we have to overcome. And that's standard for everybody's life. But I don't want it to be for lack of support that they've got into a situation where they were more at risk of something happening to them. I don't know if that answers that.
Well, and maybe we can do it, answer it again on
sure.
the 31st.
Sorry, I'm trying to read through everything. Juanita, where did you get that question from? The dignity of risk.
It was in the Q&A, yes.
Okay. You know, if I can have a few minutes during that call on the 31st to address this in the beginning, I think that I could probably do a much better job.
And all the questions that have been asked that we haven't answered will be, and we'll keep that one in to answer on the 31st, because for everyone, that session will be devoted completely to your questions, both that have been proposed now and that you send to us later or ask during the call. So thank you, Dr. Queally, and to all of you who joined us today. As we said earlier, the session has been recorded and you will receive a link to it. You will also receive information about the follow-up session, which will be held with Dr. Queally on August the 31st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Any questions that we didn't answer tonight, we will answer on that evening, and we will start with the question that needs more time.
Okay.
So anyway, thank you all, and hope you have a great evening.